Let's do it. Let's do it. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to Cashed Out. And I'm just happy to be recording right now. I got to tell you, getting ready to start recording this video, and then my original mic just kind of crapped out on me. It turned on, but it wouldn't connect. So I couldn't record with that. So I had to run out, get a new mic. Now here we are. I'm just happy to be sitting down, recording, and getting this out to you. So I wanted to talk to you guys today about one of my favorite new toys that I've added to my gear collection. As you can tell by the title of the video, it's the Moza Slypod. And I got this Slypod because I was originally looking for a slider to be able to use in terms of making B-roll. And I was looking for one that was affordable. I didn't want to spend $700 to $1,000 on a good slider. So just after looking around and checking out some videos on the Moza Slypod, I decided to give it a shot. I mean, it's been out for a couple of years. It's not a brand new thing. The thing that really caught my attention, the thing that really made me want to take a chance on this Slypod is the fact that you can do a lot of creative stuff using this Slypod. And I wanted to test it out, wanted to kind of put it through its paces, and it's been a joy to use. It's been fun to use, but there's also a couple problems that I've come across that I wanted to share with you guys in this video. So we're going to do a quick review, kind of highlight some of the things, some of the features that I like about it, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the problems that I've come across when using the Slypod. So let's dig into that real quick. Now, the Slypod itself comes in a really nice carrying bag. When you open up the case, you've got everything that you need to get started. Now, the Slypod body is nice and compact, and basically it extends up to 16 inches to give you about a 39-inch length when it's fully extended. So that's a nice reach, not a ton of reach, but it's a nice reach, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here later on. One of the cool things about this Slypod is that it's got a built-in Arca Swiss mounting plate. Now, this makes it super handy when it comes to mounting it on a tripod. It's super simple to do, and it's very useful, and that's one of the things that I was really excited that they had on there. Now, continuing on the design and the body of it, as you work your way down the Slypod, there's a nice rubber grip area with the Moza emblem on there, and that grip feels really nice. That rubber texture makes it really easy to hold on to, and it's very comfortable if you're holding it for a little bit. So very nicely done in terms of the grip. The controls on the Slypod is really just a couple buttons. You've got a power button that you use to power on and power off the Slypod, but also that you use to fully extend or fully retract it quickly if you need to. Outside of the power button, it's got two buttons. It's got an extension button and a retraction. So if you click the plus on that button, it'll extend the Moza Slypod out, and then if you click the retraction button, it'll bring it right back in. So it does exactly what it says on there. So control wise, it's really simple, just literally three buttons on there, the power button and the two extension and retraction buttons on there. There's a couple different modes that you can use this Slypod in, and it's meant to be a combination of a slider and a monopod. So in terms of a slider, when you mount this on your tripod, you can actually mount it horizontally and use it as a slider to be able to get nice smooth motions from left to right. Now, this was fantastic for me. I was actually really impressed with the quality of motion that I was able to get with this Slypod. It was very smooth. It wasn't very jittery. There was a couple hiccups at the beginning of the motion. Sometimes it would just jerk a little bit at the beginning, but throughout the rest of the motion, it was very smooth. And when it stopped, it stopped very smoothly too. So that's a huge plus. A lot of times, some sliders would kind of jerk to a stop, and you kind of see that in the footage, but this one worked really well. The one thing that you want to be mindful of is making sure that you counterbalance your weight. So if your camera is a little bit heavy, you want to make sure that you're either holding the tail end of the Slypod or you have it balanced out on a couple tripods, if you will, to be able to keep it from tipping over. So just something to keep in mind, and that's with anything. You just want to make sure that you're not having your expensive camera tipping over the edge just because the weights aren't balanced. So just something to keep in mind with that. The other mode that you can use the Slypod in is in that vertical, that traditional monopod mode. And in this case, the Slypod has a 19-pound capacity in terms of holding your camera load and in that vertical position. So you can load it up with your camera, with your lenses, and you can use it as a traditional monopod, that kind of that vertical style, and be able to use slides going up and down as a traditional monopod, and you maybe even tip it forward, tip it back, just kind of work it like you typically would. Now, there's a couple different ways that you can control this Slypod, and the first way is what I talked about earlier, is with the two buttons on the Slypod itself, where you can control the extension and retraction, or you can control it using the Moza Master app. Now, this app is fantastic. It's very responsive. It works really, really well, and it connects via Bluetooth to your Slypod. You basically just open up the app and select the product that you're using. In this case, you'd select the Slypod, and it'll connect via Bluetooth, and the connection is very strong. You can actually manually control the position of the Slypod just by moving your finger up and down, or you can set custom automated motions where you set the distance that you want it to move, set a start and end point, and then let it run. And you can actually set, I think, up to 4 or 5 different paths stats that you can have it run automatically on its own, and it's very cool, very useful. I really like the app with this Slypod. So now that we've talked about the details, some of the vitals of this Slypod, let's talk about some of the creative shots, some of the things that you can actually do when it comes to adding content, adding some unique movement to your videos. There's 3 key moves that I've really liked when it comes to using this Moza Slypod, and the first one is that vertical slide, and basically it's pretty simple, it's self-explanatory. I basically set up my subject in the middle of the table or middle of some surface, and then I'll put something in the foreground right in front of my subject, and then I'll set up the Moza Slypod just a little bit further away from the table, and then I'll set a path for it to go from right below the table to reveal my subject and basically kind of have a nice reveal shot coming from the bottom up. So a nice vertical slide up shot. Really like the way that looks in terms of some of the videos that I've used it in, and it's very simple to do. You really just kind of have to set up the way you want it to look in terms of the layout, and that's about it. Just set it and forget it. The next move that I really like is the overhead slide. Now this is a unique perspective. Essentially what you do with this is you set your subject or set your products or whatever you want to do in kind of a flat lay position where it's all just kind of laid out nicely, and then you put your Moza Slypod on a tripod and you mount it horizontally, so you're right over your subject, you're right over the stuff that you're going to try and record, and basically you just set the Slypod to move in or out however you want to do it, and basically just have it kind of go right over your subject. And it's a very cool shot. It's very unique because obviously everybody has seen that overhead shot, but it's cool adding some motion to that overhead shot and be able to kind of get that overhead slide right over it. So very cool motion, and you typically can't do this with a traditional slider because the logistics of getting that right will be a little bit more tricky than it is with this Slypod. Literally with the Slypod, you just put it on a tripod horizontally and then let it ride right over your flat lay. The third and final shot that I've really liked when it comes to using this Slypod is the traditional Dolly in. It's basically just kind of zooming in, kind of bringing that Slypod right into your subject there. And this is super easy, just like you would with the overhead shot. You literally just set the Slypod on your tripod horizontally and then put the camera facing straight on, and then you just extend the Slypod out going straight into your subject. And it's a really simple shot, but it's very easy to do with a Slypod. Now it's easy to do on a traditional slider as well. You kind of do the same setup and you just kind of move it in there, but I really like it with the Slypod because I feel like it's just less setup. It's very light, it's very simple, and it's just easy to do on here too. So those have been some of my favorite shots: that vertical rise, that overhead shot, and then that Dolly in. You can get as creative as you want. I'm actually going to try out some different shots of this Slypod. I'm really excited to kind of try kind of like a diagonal rise with it, and I've seen it a couple of times and I just haven't had a chance to try it out yet. So I'll let you guys know how that turns out. Hopefully well. Hopefully I don't break my camera. So I won't. Okay, so now let's get into some of the problems that I've come across when using this Moza Slypod. It's definitely a quality product. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely a quality product, but there's just a couple things that I've seen that have been kind of like, a little bit hindrances with this model. Now, there are 2 models of the Slypod. This is the Slypod E, which is the smaller model, and then there's the Slypod Pro. Now, in terms of the Slypod E, this model that I've got, one of the main issues that I've come across is that it's a little bit short. It's a very short length, and basically when I'm standing up, I'm not a tall guy, I'm maybe about 5'6", if that, and basically when I have the Slypod fully extended, it barely comes up to my belly button. In this shot right here, it basically comes up a little bit over my belly button because I have a ball head attached to it, but the actual Slypod itself is very short. So the track length, the length that it extends out is very short, and I know the length is actually longer in the Slypod Pro. So if you need a lot of reach, the Slypod Pro might be a better option for that. And for me, I think for me right now, it's okay, but I wish it was longer, because when you're trying to get some like self-recording or your own B-roll where you want to get kind of like an eye-level shot, it's very difficult to do that with this. That's been kind of the hindrance for me, is when I do want to record myself holding some products and doing some things with it, and I just can't do it with this Slypod E because it's very short. Now, the next issue that I've had with this Moza Slypod is the vertical stability. Now, like we talked about, you can actually set it up in that vertical mode where it's sitting on the tripod feet, and you've got it in the traditional monopod mode. And the issue with this is that when it's in that mode, it's very wobbly. Like, it's very wobbly. I can kind of touch it and it'll just kind of wobble on its own. And this is what made me nervous about using my camera on that in that vertical mode, is because I had my 70-200 on there and it was a little bit wobbly before I started the motion. Now, when I started the motion, it shook a little bit. There was a little bit of shake when I started that vertical motion in that monopod mode, but as it went on, it stabilized, it kind of stayed steady. The shot looked clean. It was nice and straight, but then as soon as it stopped, it got to wobbling again. And I think the reason for that wobble is because the way that they've designed the Slypod is at the bottom there where the tripod feet connect to the Moza Slypod, it actually uses an adapter instead of connecting directly to the Slypod itself. So when you use that adapter, you've got a lot of weight with the Moza Slypod itself, and then the tripod feet are just connected to that adapter, and there's a little bit of give in terms of that adapter. So I think that adapter connection is the issue with the stability in terms of that vertical position. I haven't tried out the Slypod Pro yet, so I feel like the stability on that might be a little bit better because it is a bigger slider, so it's a little bit thicker, so that might help with keeping it balanced more vertically. But in this scenario with the Slypod E, that vertical stability is a little bit suspect. Now, my camera didn't fall and anything like that, and the big reason for that is I made sure that whenever I set up the tripod feet, I had one of the points facing forward. So I had one of the legs of the tripod facing the same way that my camera lens is facing, so that way there's no, propensity for it to tip forward. So just something to be aware of if you are going to be using a lot of those vertical shots or using it vertically. That vertical stability is not the best. If you're going to do that, make sure you're watching and you kind of got your hands ready in terms of making sure that doesn't tip over for any reason. Overall, I'd say this Moza Slypod is definitely a good purchase if you are in the market for a slider. It's very useful, it's very dynamic, it's very versatile, and you can use it for a lot of creative shots. As I mentioned, there's a couple issues with it in terms of its length and also that vertical stability where, in some scenarios, it might make more sense for you to look into that bigger Slypod Pro version. But if you're cool with that, if you can kind of work around it like I am, then this Slypod Pro will work really well. So if you're interested in checking it out, I put the link in the description below. Be sure to check that out on there. And if you have any questions, leave it in the comments. If you are using this Moza Slypod already, let me know what your experience has been. Have you kept it? Have you returned it? I'm just curious to kind of get a feel for what everybody thinks about it. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Hope it helped you out. If you did, be sure to like, subscribe if you haven't yet, and tune in next time right here on Cashed Out. All right, take it easy, guys.